Inflation in America was over, not almost over, over. The Federal Reserve published a study 4 days ago, and it says it plainly. Without tariffs, core goods prices would have fallen below pre-pandemic levels during 2025. The soft landing was done. Rate cuts were coming, family budgets were weeks away from stabilizing, and then one policy decision erased all of it. Every single percentage point of inflation above the Fed's 2% target since January 2025 traces back to one source: not supply chains, not corporate greed, not pandemic recovery lag, tariffs, all of it, 100% of the excess, and the families paying between $1,600 and $3,800 extra per year were told, repeatedly, that foreigners were footing the bill. A Federal Reserve and Columbia University study answered that claim with data. Americans paid 94% of the cost. I'm going to show you exactly where that money went, who lost their jobs anyway, and why the worst of it hasn't hit yet. Walk through the timeline with me. April 2nd, 2025. The administration announces Liberation Day tariffs at levels not seen since 1909. China, Canada, Mexico, the EU, all of it. The stated logic: foreign countries would absorb the cost, manufacturing would return, the trade deficit would shrink. By the end of 2025, the federal government had collected $187 billion more in tariff revenue than in 2024, a nearly 200% increase in 1 year. A February 2026 study from the Federal Reserve and Columbia University tracked where that money actually came from. Americans paid 94% of those tariff costs, not foreign companies, not the countries the tariffs were aimed at, American consumers and American businesses. By October 2025, exporting companies absorbed 18% of tariff costs. U.S. importers covered 27%. American consumers paid 55% through higher prices at checkout. The April 2026 Fed study found that by February 2026, pass-through had reached full dollar-for-dollar completion. The price increases are described by researchers as effectively complete and permanent. The bill has arrived, and American families are the ones holding it. The administration claimed foreign companies would eat the tariff. Trump said it in press conferences, in op-eds, publicly and repeatedly. The data says 94% was paid by Americans. Here is why this was always predictable. Tariffs work by making imported goods more expensive. That is the mechanism. That is the entire theory. If foreign exporters actually absorbed the full cost, imported goods would not become more expensive. Domestic alternatives would not become more competitive, and the protectionist goal would fail completely. The price increase is not a side effect of tariff policy. It is the operating principle. The administration either misunderstood this or chose not to say it out loud. Either way, American families paid the bill. What does a 3.1% increase in core goods prices mean outside of a policy document? We are not talking about indicator movement here. We are talking about the checkout line, the gas pump. Whether the paycheck that arrives Friday still covers what it covered last March. 73% of Americans across party lines are worried about paying for groceries. That number is not a coincidence. A Council on Foreign Relations poll from January 2026 found over 65% of respondents said tariffs made everyday items less affordable. Food, healthcare, housing, transportation, all of it. The product-level data makes it exact. All 2025 tariff actions combined pushed food prices up 2.8%. Fresh produce went up 4%. Coffee prices climbed nearly 20% in a single year, partly because Brazilian coffee imports now face a 50% U.S. tariff. Ground beef jumped over 15%. Sugar and sweets rose 5.7% year-on-year through January 2026, with a further 6.7% projected for the year ahead. U.S. corn exports to China collapsed 99%. Soybean exports fell 78%. These are not rounding errors. They are household items disappearing from budgets. For an average American family spending $800 per month on groceries, Morningstar projects non-durable goods will rise 5.6% in 2026. That is $540 more per year just on food, stacked on top of baseline inflation already running. Yale Budget Lab calculated the total household tariff cost at $570 extra in 2026. The Tax Foundation put it at $600. Neither figure captures the indirect cost of products pulled from shelves or supply options removed. Here is the piece that almost no mainstream coverage gets to, and it matters more than any of the headline numbers. Prices that go up because of tariff-driven supply shocks do not come back down. This is not a controversial claim. It is documented grocery market behavior across decades. When tariffs raise food costs, they establish a new floor. If every tariff were lifted tomorrow, consumers would not see lower prices. They would see prices that stop climbing as fast. That is a completely different outcome. Yale Budget Lab found food prices will remain elevated by 1.2% above pre-tariff levels even after all market adjustments work through. That is a permanent addition to the cost of feeding an American household. The baseline has been raised and it does not come back. Now layer in the timing. Industry analysts have been consistent. Tariff costs take 12 to 18 months to fully travel from the initial import to the retail shelf. Liberation Day was April 2025. That places the window of maximum consumer price pressure running from right now through October 2026. The worst of the grocery increases are not behind American families. They are arriving now and continuing through the rest of this year. Many retailers spent 2025 holding prices steady by drawing down inventory stockpiles built before tariffs kicked in. That approach has a hard limit. Those stockpiles are gone. JP Morgan estimates businesses that covered 80% of tariff costs themselves in 2025 will flip that ratio by late 2026, shifting 80% of the cost onto consumers. That flip is happening right now in the second quarter. Energy compounds everything. March CPI data released last week showed gas prices surged 21.2% in a single month. That is the largest monthly increase recorded since 1967, driven by the Iran war running on top of the supply disruption already created by trade policy uncertainty. Gas prices are now up 18.9% on an annual basis. Airlines are raising baggage fees to offset fuel costs. American families are now absorbing a tariff shock and an energy shock simultaneously. Lower-income households carry all of this disproportionately. When food consumes 30% of your income rather than 8%, a 5% food price increase removes far more purchasing power from the tighter budget. Fresh produce tariffs hit hardest for families living on the least flexibility in their diets. The Federal Reserve's April 2026 study did not estimate or model what tariffs might have caused. It measured what they did cause, tracking price outcomes across thousands of product categories at different tariff exposure levels 7 months after implementation. The Personal Consumption Expenditures Index, the Fed's preferred inflation measure, shows that without tariffs, core goods prices would have fallen below their pre-pandemic trend line during 2025, not held steady, fallen. Instead, they sit 3.1% above it, and the researchers attribute that gap entirely to tariffs. The tariff effect added 0.8 percentage points to overall core PCE inflation, and that pass-through is now described as effectively complete, meaning the price increases have landed and are not reversing. The St. Louis Fed separately found tariffs explained 0.5 percentage points of headline PCE inflation in just the June through August window alone. Harvard Business School data showed imported goods prices rose 4% between March and September 2025, adding 0.7 percentage points to CPI on their own. Goldman Sachs estimated tariffs added 0.5 percentage point to 2025 inflation overall, consistent with Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell publicly attributing all inflation above the 2% target to the tariff program. The monetary policy consequence is critical and almost never discussed. Heading into 2025, the Federal Reserve had rate cuts in range. Inflation was tracking toward the target. The path to lower mortgage rates, lower small business borrowing costs, lower auto loan rates was open. Tariffs closed it. You cannot use interest rate policy to undo a supply shock your own government created. Every homeowner who could not refinance in 2025, every small business that held off expansion because borrowing was too expensive, that is a direct cost of this policy that never shows up in the tariff revenue figures. The entire justification for absorbing all of this pain was that manufacturing would return, jobs would come home, factories would be built. The promise was specific and public. By February 2026, U.S. factories employed 89,000 fewer people than they did in April 2025 when the worldwide tariffs first took effect. Manufacturing construction spending dropped from $230.9 billion in January 2025 to $196.2 billion in January 2026. That is a collapse of more than $34 billion in a single year. KPMG surveyed senior U.S. executives in September 2025. 63% said they were considering reshoring. Only 10% were actually doing anything about it. By early 2026, 26% reported some engagement, but a majority said meaningful production shifts would take years, not months. The tariff authority they were supposedly responding to was struck down in court before a single new factory opened. Foreign direct investment into the United States totaled $288 billion in 2025, slightly below the previous year and below the 10-year average. A survey of German companies with U.S. operations found 50% planned to reduce or postpone American investments due to tariff policy uncertainty. Capital goes where conditions are predictable, it left. Nearly 70% of Americans predicted 2026 would be a year of economic difficulty. Two-thirds said tariff impacts were a direct financial concern. They were right. Goldman Sachs and the Fed both confirmed the fears were justified, and the full consumer price impact is still building. On February 20, 2026, the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act does not authorize the president to impose tariffs. The Liberation Day tariffs were ruled unconstitutional. Case name, Learning Resources, Inc. versus Trump. Trump held a press conference the same afternoon. Within hours, he announced replacement tariffs under Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974. By the next morning, he had raised them to the Section 122 maximum of 15%. Treasury Secretary Bessent stated publicly that the combination of new tariff authorities would produce virtually unchanged tariff revenue in 2026. That statement deserves a close read. The Supreme Court ruled the tariffs illegal. The administration's explicit public goal was to replace them with instruments that collected the same money from the same people. The policy did not change. The legal container changed. Section 122 has a hard expiration at 150 days, placing the deadline around July 2026. Legal challenges have already been filed arguing the statute cannot be applied to trade deficits. The administration has simultaneously opened Section 301 investigations into 15 countries, and the EU to build additional tariff authority after Section 122 expires. The legal battle continues. Prices keep rising while it does. What this sequence reveals is a policy that has survived a full year, been ruled unconstitutional, immediately replaced through an alternative legal mechanism, and is now building toward a third legal foundation. The stated intent throughout has been to maintain the same economic burden on imports regardless of what the courts decide. The IMF warning published this morning is the latest data point in a forecast that is now consensus across every major institution tracking this. Between now and October 2026, the full Liberation Day pass-through completes. Retailers who held prices steady in 2025 shift costs to consumers in 2026. JP Morgan's projection of 80% consumer responsibility by late 2026 is the baseline from analysts watching this in real time. The CFR analysis published on the one-year anniversary of Liberation Day made the same point directly. The full tariff effect on consumer prices has not yet been realized. Section 122 expires in July 2026. That creates a natural decision point. Extend the authority, let it expire and claim credit for relief, or wait for Section 301 authority to build. Each path leaves consumers at the elevated baseline. The floor does not come back down regardless of which choice is made. Political pressure is building. Affordability drove voting behavior in the most recent cycle. The Federal Reserve now has documented evidence that tariffs made affordability measurably worse. That evidence is 4 days old and was published by the Fed itself. By summer, it is the central argument in every competitive congressional race. Watch the second quarter grocery data. Retailers who held prices through 2025 are making pricing decisions right now. Items with thin margins, groceries first, are the first to move when businesses can no longer absorb the cost internally. Step back from the individual data points and look at what this policy actually accomplished. The United States entered 2025 with inflation slowing, rate cuts in range, and an economic trajectory that was measurably working. The Federal Reserve's own study shows the alternate timeline clearly. Without tariffs, core inflation normalized in 2025, prices stabilized, rate cuts followed. That path was real. It was documented. The administration chose a different one. The different path collected $187 billion in extra revenue from American families and businesses, eliminated 89,000 manufacturing jobs, collapsed manufacturing construction spending by $34 billion, blocked rate cuts that would have lowered costs across the housing and business lending markets, raised grocery prices permanently, and triggered a constitutional challenge that reached the Supreme Court. The IMF confirmed this morning that the trade disruption is now spreading globally, cutting world trade growth nearly in half and raising inflation forecasts across every major economy. The damage is not contained. Nixon's import surcharge in 1971 lasted 4 months before economic reality forced its removal. These tariffs have now survived more than a year, been ruled unconstitutional, replaced through a backup legal mechanism, and the administration's stated goal throughout has been to keep the revenue flowing regardless of what the courts decide. Economic pressure does not negotiate. Policies that cost families thousands of dollars per year while delivering none of the promised jobs do not hold indefinitely against democratic accountability. The data says the worst of the consumer price impact arrives this quarter and next. That is also when political pressure becomes hardest to ignore. The Federal Reserve published the evidence 4 days ago. The IMF confirmed it this morning. Subscribe if you want to stay ahead of where this lands next.